Actions, Responses to Trafficking, the podcast that shines a spotlight on new and established trafficking responses in the UK and beyond.
Welcome back to Actions. Today I'm speaking with Rosie Riley, who is the founder and the CEO of VITA, has been delivering training for healthcare professionals and is a doctor working between emergency and general practice based in Somerset. Rosie's been involved in the modern slavery sector for a long time, inputting to the Modern Slavery Act Statutory guidance, is a core member of the NHS England Modern Slavery Network and the Home Office Modern Slavery Strategy and Implementation Victim Support Group. Hi Rosie, thanks for coming on the Actions podcast.
Hi, nice to see you. Thanks for having me.
Pleasure. It's great to have you here. Could we start maybe with a little introduction to you? Can you tell us more about your journey to this area of modern slavery and human trafficking?
Yeah, it's a long story, so I'll try and keep it brief. But essentially, I started finding out about this world of modern slavery when I was actually halfway through my medical school training in Bristol, so around 2013. And it was in response to watching a Channel 4 Unreported World documentary series. And one of the episodes was on an orphanage that I'd actually stayed in for a month. And It actually, through that 30-minute episode, the whole thing was about that specific orphanage in Kathmandu, Nepal, and how they've been trafficking the children. So it started really with quite a personal connection where I felt very much almost part of this system of abuse and exploitation of these children, very specifically where I knew exactly who these kids were.
My goodness.
And so that sort of responding to that and trying to process that, I think that I was looking into actually how I could impact somewhere around me. And I looked into, I thought, I'm going to become a doctor one day. And I started asking some questions of doctors and nurses around me as to, do you know what this is, this form of exploitation? Have you heard of human trafficking? Do you see victims and survivors in your health settings? And generally found that people were saying, there are some real unusual trends. There are some red flags that I'm seeing, and I have absolutely no idea what it means or what to do about it. So I put together a training package with the support of some colleagues in the anti-trafficking sector. And I started delivering this training to some general practices around Bristol. The demand was enormous. So there were some surgeries who were actually specialists in sexual health, assault and support services and things for victims of domestic abuse and other forms of abuse. But actually, I was still shocked to feel that there was still that real need for the information that we were talking about.
Yeah.
And so this was way back in the training, which I just continued to deliver the training wherever there was demand. And that sort of was the beginning of the life of VITA. Over the years, more and more health professionals have come on board the team. And it's actually become structured into this training program that we've just delivered now to more than 2,000 health professionals across the UK. And it's commissioned by NHS trusts, departments, teams, individuals. Our aim with the training, I'm a doctor in A&E at the moment, and I'm going to be a GP in a few years' time. And one of my biggest bugbears from any safeguarding training is that we get a lot of information about red flags, and we get a lot of information about how to escalate our concerns. And we get absolutely no information whatsoever on how to be when your patient is sitting in front of you. Like, how do you interact with your patient? Yeah. How do you create that safe, confidential space? How do you apply what's called trauma-informed care? And so the aim of the training is actually to meet that gap that, I guess it's been sculpted by health professionals like me who know exactly what it's like to sit in the middle of A&E and you've got a 7, sometimes more these days, hour wait to see the next patient, and you've got somebody where you're concerned and there are enough red flags there. You don't know if they're trafficked, you don't know if they're experiencing domestic abuse, but actually there's enough red flags there. And then what do you do? How do you remove an accompanying person from the room without raising their alarm or suspicions?
Yeah, absolutely. I'm so glad you mentioned that bugbear, because it's exactly my bugbear as well. And I've always felt this, that we give so much information about what is trafficking, what are the signs, how important it is to report and intervene. But actually the tools of exactly that, if you've got somebody in the room with them, how do you delicately remove that person? How do you open a conversation without, because there's so many people worried about re-traumatizing, saying the wrong thing, making somebody completely shut down. So it's great that this training provides those skills.
Yeah.
So is it quite practical in terms of the way people then can apply their learning?
It's so practical that we have many testimonials from doctors and nurses and other health professionals saying that I can literally go back to the ward now and apply these skills,
Wow.
because it's sort of phrases to use, and how to start building a rapport with someone who might be rightly incredibly lacking any trust in you. And also, I think a lot of what is helpful from our training that we provide is not only the clues to spot the signs, but also suggestions in behavior and ways people respond to trauma in general. So not just we're not just looking for that grateful victim, someone who's willing and responsive to offers of help, and really happy to sort of listen to you and trust you and build a rapport with you and trust. That actually isn't how human beings necessarily behave when they're experiencing trauma and surviving. And so we can apply our science lens here, and our medical understanding really of trauma science, and how our bodies and minds and our brain actually adapts to protect you from harm. And so why would somebody trust me? It's actually incredibly appropriate that they don't trust me, because perhaps traffickers have sculpted this lack of trust in any sort of professional that they encounter, or that is actually their past experience. And so where actually it's appropriate that they may not necessarily be withdrawn or not engaging, but actually maybe more aggressive or more likely to run and abscond, we call in the sort of health sector.
Right.
So how do you recognize those signs, and then how do you use those skills that we have to de-escalate and create that safe, confidential space without forcing disclosure, because they still won't necessarily feel safe to share what's going on with you.
Absolutely.
So the aim is actually to readjust. I'm not necessarily trying to change the way that victims respond to us and make them feel safe with me. I'm actually trying to change me, and actually go, well, I my role isn't to be a brave savior doctor, but actually it's to look at what another type of positive outcome might be, and that would be something like planting those seeds that suggest you're an individual worthy of dignity and care, and when you're ready, this is a safe place. And we're safe people, and this is a seed planting exercise. And I'm not trying to identify forced disclosure. And actually, it's almost like this is a protected environment where somebody's in control. This may be the only protected environment where somebody really feels control. And it's almost like that, in a sense, is seed planting. This is what having control of this room feels like.
Right.
That's good. And you're in control. I'm not going to force you to do anything you don't want to do. So we're teaching doctors how to do these things, and nurses how to do these things.
That's excellent. And so then it's really encouraging people that if they do or are ready eventually to come forward and access support, that is the place where they can come, because they've, exactly like you've said, you've planted that seed. They know that's a resource that's available to them.
Yeah, exactly. And I mean, it's not, we're quite realistic with the health professionals we train. You're not going to undo the power of perhaps juju, even spiritual control over people who've been trafficked using that form of coercion and control. You're not going to do that in one consultation. I mean, why are we mentally sort of trying to undo that in one consultation? We are simply seed planting and letting people know this is a safe place. And actually, when it's right for them, they have more control of what's happening to them. Because ultimately, if I go in and I'm wanting my agenda to rescue and get people out, then to them, someone is forcing, coercing and manipulating me to do something I don't want to do. So who am I to them other than maybe another form of abuser?
Yeah, that's true. And I think it is important that practitioners and professionals working with potential survivors recognize the ability to sort of mirror the control and the conditions that people are in when they're being trafficked and exploited can sometimes be ways that we end up engaging with people as well. And we have to really reflect and change that behavior in ourselves too.
Yeah, absolutely.
And with the healthcare professionals that are learning about this, how compatible is this with other things that they're doing? Because I'm just aware that they're probably trying to look for a lot of concerns, a lot of safeguarding concerns as part of their work. Do they feel like this is yet another thing, or is there a compatibility that actually the skills cut across a whole range of other issues?
Well, this is sort of the beauty of what we're trying to do, because it's written by health professionals. We're very aware that we don't want any more training that is of no use. And the last thing I need is to be told a lot of information by someone who has a lot of expertise on something where actually I have no idea how I would apply this to my clinical practice or know what to do differently at all. So I think that the main outcome is, we're really clear with the health professionals that you won't know what is going on, and you're very unlikely to know what is going on. They're really unlikely to disclose anything to you because you're a stranger in your own comfort zone environment. My health service is my comfort zone, not theirs. And there's that fear and there's that threat response and all of this going on. So it's very unlikely, unless I have that longer term relationship with somebody, to necessarily have that trust in that one consultation. So I don't know if somebody's going to be experiencing trafficking or domestic abuse or any form of exploitation. So we're not there to equip them in how to identify solely victims of modern slavery and human trafficking. We're there to actually equip them with the safeguarding skills that they need for anyone who may be experiencing any form of trauma or safeguarding concern. So the skills of, for example, learning how to and practicing how to remove an accompanying person from the room and the language that you can use is applicable for anyone. And a lot of the time we tell them to practice these skills when there isn't a safeguard, when they don't have that gut instinct that's a bit of an unusual, I'm a bit twitchy about this situation. So we tell them to practice these skills when they aren't worried and there's just two people that you're like, well, this sounds all very normal and I wouldn't have thought there was any kind of safety issue underneath it all. And that way you have the language, it's natural, it's fluent, and it's routine. And when you do come across a patient where they've got an accompanying person and you're like, oh my gosh, this is it. Oh my goodness, there are so many red flags already and I need to get this person out of the room. You're rehearsed in it. It's just routine. And then actually you're much more likely to create almost a bit of a rapport with a potential perpetrator in that way, so that they don't feel so threatened and are less likely to want to whiz off or never bring someone back to this health service, or are more likely to leave the room to start with anyway.
Yeah, absolutely. So it sounds really positive on all fronts. What's the kind of feedback you're getting from practitioners that have done this? Have they been able to apply this learning? Has it been successful for them?
Well, yeah, it's amazing. I'm obviously going to say that. I wish you could hear from some of the clinicians. We have nearly 1,000 pieces of pre and post course self-assessment of knowledge and confidence, and it's a fairly crude way of assessing. So before they fill out their sort of scores on different categories of how confident they feel on a 10-point scale, and then they fill it out afterwards. And crudely, the biggest impact that they have is in those consultation, applied trauma-informed consultation skills. And so identifying, I don't think without equipping health professionals with the consultation skills that we should be focusing so much on spotting the signs and identifying, because actually there's so much potential for harm here. And train the wrong people to do the wrong things as well is something I'm really passionate about. It's not appropriate for other staff who don't have these conversations to know this information. So we're not actually inviting other staff perhaps who wouldn't have consultations with patients to do this training. It's not appropriate, because their role is actually more to spot the signs and escalate to the person who might be having this conversation. I think I've gone off your question there, but anyway.
No, it's exactly that. It's about how useful it is. And I definitely appreciate you referencing also the appropriate roles, and we often, I have these conversations a lot as well about the right person to be trained, because we need to manage people's expectations about how involved they can be and when it's appropriate to open these conversations because of that potential to do harm. So it's great that's being recognized in this training as well.
100%. There's enormous potential to do harm, and I'm not saying that necessarily with the way that we're delivering this training to the health professionals. The harm is actually in the I need to go in and I need to help someone, I need to get someone out, and I need to get the police involved here, and I need to when you don't understand the context of what that might do. I mean, we've got even the national referral mechanism on in the background, and as well as any of us, that this is becoming more horrendously hostile and dehumanizing than ever. And so where I'm saying, well, hang on, even, for example, Albanian men being singled out, Albanians in general being singled out at the moment by government as, well, they're never victims of anything kind of thing, get them back to Albania. Well, hang on, if I've got an Albanian chap in front of me where I'm, they're disclosing that, there's some forced labor going on in the background, and I want to identify and escalate, I know there's an enormous risk that they wouldn't be listened to compared to, say, I don't know, not an Albanian. So, I mean, there's enormous impact and potential harm simply from our government response. So we have to understand that context. If, we're trying to break that savior mentality, it's a big, important step, I think.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And it's really refreshing to hear. And it's true. And it's part of, when we do intervene, we do need to have a sense of the bigger picture and the ramifications for different groups. And actually, for somebody who's undocumented, potentially there's more harm to happen to them if they're not going to be believed, if they're going to be treated as an undocumented person as opposed to a survivor of trafficking. And you're right, you do need to understand enough of the national referral mechanism and the sector to be able to convey that information appropriately so that people can make informed choices about what their next steps are as well.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, on another level as well, we've got survivor leadership and survivor advocacy within our group, where they can actually review our materials and have been reviewed our materials before, sort of early stages. And I think that it's ensuring where we're creating that safe, confidential space, we're not missing key important bits that actually would have made a real impact.
Okay, so that's really interesting. So you've included survivors and what they would have wished for during these kinds of encounters with medical professionals?
So we have survivor leaders in the leadership team who've reviewed the training materials, mainly just to say, actually, this is in line with what I think would be helping to create a safe, confidential environment.
Brilliant.
But also helpful for as a barometer of, I still wouldn't have felt safe or trusted, perhaps. And again, not using that one survivor or to be the voice of all survivors, but it's helpful to hear from those with lived experience that this is it's about that seed planting, and that's the important thing that we're trying. Break that savior mentality and plant those seeds, and then that creates that awareness that I remember that person that treated me with dignity, and I was in control. Whether that's a sort of whether that's something that they're able to put words to or not, it does make a massive impact, I think.
Absolutely. And so it's really clear that this training is useful for practitioners to do exactly like you've said, just to plant those seeds, to create a potential environment where people might be able to disclose or come for help in the future. Does the same training also provide skills for people who are already identified survivors of trafficking, and the way medical practitioners can support them after they'd already been identified as survivors?
That's a really good question. The training that we're delivering to sort of broadly doesn't as much. So there's a small amount of when you have somebody who is in the NRM process already, or out the other side, or not in the NRM but is out of their trafficking experience. So we talk about re-traumatization and not digging into any trauma that is not going to change your medical plan, so that we don't actually need to know about what's happened to somebody. And that's actually very re-traumatizing unless it's medically relevant. And even then you ask permission to know that information. We don't necessarily train, for example, if you have a GP who's looking after survivors, the next layer of we've got big plans in terms of where we're going next. And some of our VITA network members, for example, and our VITA team are work within Helen Bamber Foundation and have a lot of experience working with survivors there. So we'll be hopefully creating new training packages for that longer term medical health support. One of the areas where we're actually going into at the moment, we're working with the physician response unit in the Royal London, and they're like the land version of the helicopter team. So they go out to do really serious trauma responses, but they essentially bring the emergency department to the community. And so we're developing training, and we've had a big roundtable before Christmas to look at what we need to do in a community setting, because health professionals go out into people's homes, and that might be a health visitor, a midwife, might be an emergency response to a 999 call. And actually, when you spot signs in somebody's home, we're now developing training and a pathway of what to do when it's like there are children, there's obvious abuse, we need the police involved, this is an unsafe situation, but the grey, unsure, I felt a bit weird about that, I don't know, what do I do, how do I, because there might be some information sharing that might be quite important.
Okay,
so that's our next era.
That's brilliant. So really big plans for new training, and clearly really you've got a finger on the pulse of what needs medical practitioners have in this field and the sorts of areas that they're in and the kind of support they need.
Yeah, and I mean, we're piloting this in March, so it's really in the full swing. We're creating a new video as part of our training, because we use lots of different multimedia in our training so that it's actually sort of educationally engaging. And so a new video we're going to be filming very soon for that and piloting it with the new team in March. So that will be exciting.
Very exciting. Oh, good luck with that. That sounds really, really valuable. Thanks for sharing. And you've just mentioned actually the VITA network. This might be a nice moment to introduce what that network is and tell us a little bit more about it.
Yeah, sure. So I think it was towards the end of 2019, a few of us within the anti-trafficking sector were saying, well, actually it'd be useful to have a network where we connect as individuals looking at the health response and the public health response to human trafficking and exploitation, because there's lots of sort of siloed work going on all over the show, and unless you know somebody, then you wouldn't know what work they're doing, and it's actually incredibly isolating. You feel like you're the only one who is looking into this, and you just feel very lonely in this world. So we there are a few of us, we decided actually VITA would be quite a useful platform to use, so we created the VITA network. And so the aim is to connect individuals from various sorts of backgrounds, but actually all focusing on the health response, person-centered health response to modern slavery, human trafficking, to then equip each other through sharing of knowledge, skills, and resources, and then to mobilize that information to not just have that information shared, but actually look at how we can apply that within our different workforces. Whether that's actually more a social work context or an A&E or a GP setting or wherever we may be. And so we had our first meeting end of 2019. Little did we know we were about to have COVID and all of that. We did have to have a big pause because most of us were health professionals, so we had to kind of full whack into the health setting for 2020, early 2020 anyway. Yeah. But it's been amazing since, and it's grown. Our network, the kind of group that run it's the Network Advisory Council, and that's made up of health professionals, academics. So we've got dentist lead, we've got survivor lead, or a consultant by lived experience. We've got various different health professionals from different backgrounds, medical students, nursing students, and we run what essentially is our network. And we've had blogs, we have monthly blogs, monthly newsletters. We're looking actually to start a podcast soon.
Brilliant.
And we've had some webinars as well, where we host webinars and invite, you could be a health professional with no idea about VITA or any training or anything like that, or you could be sort of quite active in the anti-trafficking sector, but sort of we've had lots of engagement from various individuals there.
That's great. And it must be really reassuring for people to have colleagues sort of from the same sector to be able to bounce ideas off or get support or get advice that's more appropriate to your sector, as opposed to sectors that might not necessarily have the same needs or gaps or issues.
Yeah, absolutely. And it allows us to feed into each other's work as well. So you've got that kind of benefit of collective knowledge, collective experience. And so where, for example, we've got Jordan, who is our blog coordinator. He's a medical student, so he'll be qualifying as a doctor in not too long. But he's actually put a motion to the BMA, the British Medical Association, to recognise modern slavery as a health threat. And so he's done that after being with us. And then we've got two of the paediatricians in the team, Dr. Laura Wood and Dr. Sarah Boutros, who in 2022 have just published with the Royal College of Paediatric and Child Health the new guidelines on child trafficking and what to do as a paediatrician and a health professional who works with children. So we're writing national guidance for the Royal Colleges, and we hope to be doing that in not too long. We've been invited to write for the Royal College of Emergency Medicine. So for all emergency medicine practitioners, we'll be writing the guidance. And so it provides that platform really where we go, actually, this person is better to speak for this issue. This person's better to speak for this issue. And we can review all these things, wrestle with some difficult concepts. And then actually we're very solution orientated. We want applied output. We don't want just a moan party, because it can be quite difficult with some of the policy and the national and the sort of narrative that's being painted. We're fighting a sort of difficult battle there.
Definitely. And I'm sure there's value in having a moan party every now and again, just as a vent, as a tool totally to cope with the situation. But yeah, that sounds really, really valuable. And what's some of the reflections or learning that you're sort of generating from creating this network, from delivering your training? Is there other things that you could share with the listeners from what you're kind of reflecting?
I'm finding just to sort of watch the network grow. I'm finding there are two things. I'll try and remember both before I forget. The first is that it's got teeth. It's actually actioning what we're talking about. So that makes people feel like they're contributing. Well, this is a network where there is real output for what we're talking about. So it's not just meetings that sort of don't tend to go anywhere. So there are real tangible things that we're watching and we're seeing happen from what we're discussing. And then I said I wasn't going to forget the other one. Yes, no, I remember it now. So the other thing that I'm aware of is seeing how people are growing in their confidence from being supported in this environment. One of the things that myself and some of the other leadership within VITA are very conscious of is to not sacrifice ourselves in this process in the campaign to uphold and change systems. We're very aware that actually we need to recognise our own responses to trauma, being very aware that vicarious trauma can really impact our own health and well-being, and also that almost we need to look at what freedom looks like, if that's really what the sort of goal is for individuals, and what does that mean for us as well. So we're looking at a sort of a holistic of looking after ourselves, looking after others, and then that creates this really less like a hamster wheel of never ending struggle and work, and more and more and more. So very conscious of, right, let's not react to that. There might be extreme pressure for example, the anti-trafficking sector to respond to this really difficult Home Office policy that's just come out. And we're trying to be less reactive and take a step back consciously and go, well, actually, we're sort of on our knees from a health perspective. So perhaps we just need to take a bit of time to respond here, or I don't know. It's not giving very concise. We're just conscious of creating a healthy, supportive environment for everybody.
Absolutely. Yeah. And that's really good to hear, because you're right. I mean, the sector can feel very, very fast paced at times. So sometimes long periods of silence, and then, huge moments where big announcements happen, it feels very much like we get pulled into responding and having to have a stance on this or a position on this because of the nature of the way that policies get announced and the way that guidances get updated. And you're right, I think it is important and really healthy for us to remember to just sometimes just take a step back and not necessarily be swept away with that tide. So that's really good to hear. And it's also great to hear that people feel like there's actual concrete outputs happening through the network, because I imagine everybody's so incredibly busy. So to even justify the time spent being involved, actually seeing outputs as a result is really helpful and incentivizing as well.
Absolutely. And I mean, an example of that is our safe refuge response to the war in Ukraine.
Right.
We sort of, taking a step back from lots of things, we're very also aware of when we need to write, we need to absolutely act here. This needs a voice from trauma. This is a very immediate trauma that's happening. And how do we bring our health expertise here to look at the vulnerabilities that might leave people vulnerable to trafficking and exploitation? And so we rallied and we worked long into the night, and we had our whole group pulled together, Safe Refuge kind of resource pack, from a host welcome pack for hosts to information for asylum seekers who need a bit of translated health information, and where we haven't recreated the wheel. We tried to identify, for example, doctors of the world have incredible translated health information, like how do you understand the NHS and things like that. But also when we met, we have last year 3 new midwifery colleagues who've joined our VITA network. And so we've got a professor, associate professor, and a midwife who's got a lot of expertise in modern slavery. And as soon as they arrived, they were able to input directly into this. And essentially, when we were speaking with the anti-trafficking and refugee sector to provide some sort of national response, their input was immediately feeding into what we were saying to 400 NGOs. So it's a platform that the network has created. And I think it's not for me to speak at all. It's literally to create this platform because the people around me are the experts, and they have so much wisdom and so much knowledge there. And it's just like, right, where do we target? What do we need to, so there's a bit of strategy in the background. But that's just an example.
Yeah. And it sounds like a really vibrant network then. So people are able and enabled to get involved as and how they can and on the issues that they're seeing and actually develop responses to. So that is incredibly empowering for professionals that must feel so disempowered so much of the time, because so much is beyond their control and they're kind of within a system that they can't really create huge amounts of change within, right?
Yeah, it can feel like treacle, the NHS, especially now.
Yeah, no, exactly.
You're sort of swept in this sort of machine that's not doing particularly well at the moment. But
yeah, that must be incredibly tiring for everybody to be part of, and to be part of every day as well of working life.
Yes.
Rosie, you mentioned in terms of the approach of the network and the training, a public health approach. And we hear that referenced a lot in the sector. And it would be great to just hear a little bit more about what that means in the context of modern slavery responses, and specifically for healthcare professionals.
Absolutely. So we take a public health approach to our health response. So where I'm not a public health expert, I can apply public health principles as a health professional with an individual in front of me.
Right.
So essentially we've got Liz Such, who is a public health expert and academic, who is part of our network, and she's very involved in the national leading the national public health approach and what that means. And I think she'd be excellent to interview as well. I don't know if she'd allow me to say that, but
great, yeah.
I think taking a lot of understanding a public health approach is essentially looking at the upstream reasons that leave people vulnerable to exploitation. So the way that she phrased it, and the way that I've sort of kind of conceptualized it really, is you've got the primary, secondary, and tertiary prevention response. Primary is preventing it. So, tackling poverty and those really upstream vulnerable, causes that drive the machine that might be exploitation. So preventing that and tackling those social determinants almost. There might be smaller ones, like, for example, looking at abuse within a family and actually supporting families where actually that person then may be, those sorts of examples. You might have secondary prevention, which I sort of see as intervention. So, for example, if you've got a lady, a patient who's pregnant, and identifying them as potentially vulnerable and intervening, that intervention is actually secondary prevention. You're preventing further harm. And also that person's a mum. So the trauma her body is experiencing may also impact the growth and development of her fetus, and that impacts on, perhaps whether that behavior, survival mechanisms that she's needing to survive that trauma, that has real legacy perhaps with her child, or even the health of that pregnancy in general, whether the pregnancy will continue to term. So there's real intervention that prevents further harm, and we need to think about that transgenerational impact of trauma. You're not, even if somebody is there's intervention that can stop trafficking, that prevention of further harm, that can, it's how do we interrupt that cycle of transgenerational trauma. And then tertiary is more looking at care of a survivor, and that equipping them with, or supporting their empowerment, so that there isn't that future risk of trafficking again once they've already been exploited. So that's sort of how I think about prevention, intervention, and then person-centered survivor care as primary, secondary, and tertiary public health. And I'm sure that public health academics would be much more eloquent than me, but a lot of what I try and do or our colleagues try and do is look at, well, what does this mean in a real life setting with real patients in front of me? So my colleague Laura, who's a pediatrician, and I, we've created something called the social medicine Zoom. So when you have a patient in front of you, you look at that human being. So what is the health of that person in front of me? So there may be, for example, a case there, a County Lines case I saw, we would use as an example. We've got a child, you've got the overdose that might have happened, you've got the mental health impact, all the health, the physical health and the mental health of that person. Right. And then you zoom out a little, you go, well, look at their family. How is that family unit impacting on that person's health? Because I can treat them physically, they're going back to a really, really dysfunctional and quite potentially dangerous family unit.
Right.
What about the context of the community that person's in? There's actually a potentially very broken relationship between kids and the police, or they're on the peripheries of school, and the school concept isn't very protective from And then you think about, well, actually regionally, there's a lot of County Lines activity, particularly in this area, and this is actually what it looks like. And then nationally, you look at, well, policy, what does policy do to sort of isolate kids, or, so you zoom, and then you can zoom back in to that one human in front of you and go, right, well, I have this better contextual awareness of the social impact of that. They're not just an isolated island of a person, but now I might understand why it's actually really difficult to say, to sort of target their drug addiction or whatever it is, because of, and
those
so
wider contextual,
exactly. I'm trying. This is big training that we've written for Health Education England, so I'm trying to summarise it. So probably not very well, but
no, that's so clear, and the way that you've just spelled that out actually just makes so much sense. And I'm sure that's really helpful for practitioners who are in that situation at that moment in time, who might feel very frustrated by people potentially needing to access services again and again for the same kind of recurrent issues, but kind of understanding the context or the situation or the family environment or the societal conditions that they're in kind of helps them to understand the person that's presenting in front of them.
Yeah. I think we're also very aware that we're trying not to make it feel like it's your responsibility to sort all of that.
Right.
So it's more just an awareness of that, so that when I say, I don't know, if somebody has hepatitis, for example, but they're homeless, well, why would getting them to a clinic in the hospital, of course, that their life might be quite chaotic for various reasons, and actually what they won't receive the letter from the hospital. You've got to think about all
Yeah.
these different things of so it's just how do we adapt health services to create that safe environment that actually could be person-centered and actually tackles the things that need to be tackled, and an awareness of what is actually broader health. And that's where we go, well, actually health professionals can then speak at our regional platforms, and they perhaps need to change the way that the hospital responds to this. And then actually, well, nationally, we need to readjust how we understand trauma and how we respond to trauma, and some of the health policies, the national policies that come out. So there's a voice for health at every layer that we're trying to sort of learn what a health voice looks like.
Yeah, and find feet for that, I guess. And
Yeah.
and that is really interesting, because I guess we often, think about health support as that kind of that tertiary stage, that intervention once it's passed and once it's become sort of at that level, whereas actually all that upstream things that you've just mentioned, and the context that somebody is in is so important to have understood and leveraged, so that we we can understand and address those issues.
Yeah,
exactly like you've said, further upstream as well.
Yeah, absolutely. And so, I mean, it's interesting when we're at these platforms, at these national meetings or whatever, and sort of we're turned to for the, like, do we think we need therapy here or whatever? And because there's a bump and a bruise, like, where would they go to A&E for this? And then we can go, well, actually, don't even think about going near trauma psychotherapy when they are in an NRM system where they have to wait years in essentially what is prolonged poverty states.
Yeah.
And how does poverty impact on your mind and your sense of well-being, where any day you could hear from the Home Office that you might not get your conclusive grounds decision, and you might be deported. And so you're in a state of waiting for potentially terrifying decision for years, and it's in the state of poverty where you're only getting a small amount of money per week, you're not allowed to work or have an education. And that's bad for health. So we can say, well, actually this is not conducive to good health outcomes. So don't go anywhere near a trauma psychotherapy sort of solution when they're not in a safe, that they're in a current threat state, quite rightly. And so you don't want to remove people's pillars that hold people up until you can replace
until
a pillar
they're
with
really
a healthy option, until it's ready. So
that makes a lot of sense. And do you feel like you're being listened to, and this particular point of view or approach is gaining traction and gaining understanding?
I think absolutely within the anti-trafficking sector, and I think that's where I think a lot of us have learned over the years. So I've been mostly sitting and observing and learning from colleagues, and I think over time I've started to realize, well, what do we contribute here? And so that's been really well received, I think, and also we've got a really good relationship with a lot of the anti-trafficking sector colleagues, and very mutual, supportive, and not competitive, I think, as well. Something we're really actively trying to not be another, like, an alternative to people's other options, but actually, I mean, with Home Office policy, that's a bigger issue. I think that the narrative, we're trying to draw light, as many anti-trafficking and refugee sector colleagues are doing, draw light to the dog whistling, for example, where they say asylum seeker next to dangerous foreign criminal in the same sentence, and that's training people's minds to assume that they're the same thing. And that's been going on for a long time, and it's very difficult because it creates a really toxic narrative about incredibly vulnerable people. So, for example, the other day in A&E, I saw a patient who was an asylum seeker who'd literally arrived the day before, and she brought her children. She's staying in a hotel and put up by the Home Office, and is an asylum seeker now. So she has free recourse to public funds, but was like, are we in London? I have diabetes. I need medicine. I don't know how to get it. Like, what do I do? And so I had to teach. She wasn't in A&E for anything other than, had no idea what the NHS was, what city she was in. I was so shocked that she has diabetes and she wasn't plumbed into a GP and no one had told her
Yeah.
what the language of our health service was like,
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
what a GP is, and what a hospital does, and what A&E is for, and all these things. I literally had to take her through that, and
Yeah. Yeah, and you would
it
expect that to be
shocked me,
part
really.
of an initial needs assessment and an initial induction, because it is really critical that people are then plugged in straight away to avoid more chronic issues happening down the line, right?
Or an emergency diabetes presentation.
Yeah.
She, it's really essential. She has her insulin and things, and
Absolutely.
so that shocked me, really. But that was just a small example of that hostility. That
Yeah.
no, we're not helping you. We're trying to make it as horrible as possible so that
And
you'll
it's
leave.
difficult for you to access basic support and care. Yeah, you're right. Yeah, that is quite shocking. Thanks for sharing that, Rosie. Unfortunately, though, also it's all we have time for as well. I don't want to. It feels like a difficult note to end on. I'm really sorry, but I wanted to thank you so much for spending your time and being on this podcast and sharing the information about VITA, the network, and the training as well. It's been great to hear about your incredible work, and I wish you luck with all of it.
Thank you so much for having me. I've really, I really enjoyed being here. Thank you.
Pleasure having you. If people would like to find out more, if they would like to do the training or join the network, what's the best way for them to get in touch with you?
Well, I think the best way would be you can email us at info@vita-training.com. You can go on the training website, which is vita-training.com, or you can go on the network website, which is vita-network.com, and that gives a lot more information. You can sign up to our newsletters, and you can look at all of the members of the team we have, and find out a lot more about the sort of, the work we're doing.
Brilliant. Okay, that's awesome. And I will include all of those addresses in the show notes. So if anybody wants to see them, then they're there as well. Brilliant. Thanks again, Rosie. So nice to speak to you.
Nice to speak to you too.
Same. Thank you. Thanks also to the listeners or the viewers of this podcast. Until the next episode, goodbye.
You've been listening to Actions, Responses to Trafficking podcast. Music used in this episode is Inspiration, written by Rayful Crux and sourced from freepd.com. Actions is produced and presented by Catherine Baldacchino.